Oh.
Wait, cut the music.
The question, what is your favourite piece of art, is an interesting one to ask, because in some ways it puts a lot on the respondent. The question doesn't specify anything specifically about their favourite aspect of art. It doesn't ask what your favourite piece of art is visually, or what your favourite piece of interpretive art is. It doesn't even specify a medium. Painting, sculpture, mixed media, photography, film, game? See, for a growing number of people, I think the answer to that question might not be as straightforward as it initially seems. Sure, a lot of people could probably tell you about how they like the look of a classic painting, or are inspired by the amount of realistic detail of a classical statue. And that is, of course, a completely valid answer. I'm not about to gatekeep art, but what I am going to do is propose a new valid answer to the question. A video game. If I had to answer that question, I would put forward the games The Stanley Parable and Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy as possible candidates. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who would put forward games as art. Now, hang on a second, I am getting a bit ahead of myself. The question of what is your favourite piece of art is so non-specific on paper, and yet some people would be a little confused if your answer to it was a video game. So that implies some level of specificity. That specificity comes from the word art. So what defines art? A very base level Google search for define art will give you an answer of the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Google's word definitions come from Oxford dictionaries, so there's one definition. If we scroll down a bit, we'll find the Wikipedia page for art, so let's see what it says. Art is a diverse range of human activity and resulting product that involves creative or imaginative talent expressive of technical proficiency, beauty, emotional power, or conceptual ideas. Okay, so where did Wikipedia get this from? Well, there are 3 sources for this. An Oxford Dictionary page, a Merriam-Webster page, and a Lexico page. But if you read each of these, they actually all seem to differ slightly. And the Oxford Dictionary definition is nearly identical to the one that you'll find on Google, which is from Oxford Languages anyway. So what's up? What is the definition of art? The truth is, that's a less than easy question to answer definitively due to art's nature and core principles, but let's get into it a bit. The base question that we're trying to answer is about the Stanley Parable and Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy using artistic expression, so some major assumptions are being made. And assumptions are not a great thing to be making for research like this, so I'm going to give a working definition of what I mean by art and artistic expression for the sake of putting us on the same page. Whether or not you agree with this decision is entirely up to you, and I'm not going to argue against that, but I am going to try and at least help you understand where my working definition comes from. Okay, let's take a look at where we're at for our working definition. We've got 4 current sources. Our Google/Oxford Languages definition tells us that art is about the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. Makes sense. Our Merriam-Webster definition is actually a handful of definitions of different use cases of the word. The most relevant is definition 4, which says that art is defined as the use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the use of aesthetic objects. If we look down to 6, we'll see an even more simple answer that basically defines art as decorative or illustrative elements in printed manner. Well, now we've got a source telling us about how art is aesthetic. Let's take a look at the Lexico source. Art in which the idea or concept presented by the artist is considered more important than its appearance or execution. Well, that definition somewhat goes against the Merriam-Webster definition, but wait a minute, this is defining conceptual art. What's Lexico's definition of just art? Well, first off, Lexico.com now seems to just redirect to Dictionary.com? I'm guessing this is some kind of more recent thing because the Lexico link from Wikipedia is an archive page, so let's just see what Dictionary.com defines art as. Well, here's another site telling us that art is mostly about aesthetic qualities. Okay, let's start looking elsewhere, because just looking at these definitions can be helpful, but doesn't quite have the nuance that a topic like art needs. In Thomas Adigan's entry about the definition of art, he mentions that, quote, conventionalist definitions account well for modern art, but have difficulty accounting for arts universally, effectively suggesting that a lot of traditional definitions of art are generally suitable for art as we currently know it conceptually, but doesn't quite live up to what's needed to define art as a whole. A definition of art needs to be future-proof and be able to account for changes in the field as time goes on. The way we, humanity, see art is a constantly shifting thing, and as such, a definition must account for that. Art Adjian also brings up the very real question of, well, is it even possible to give a definition that does justice to what art as a whole is? It may seem at this point like a future-proof way to define art is to simply say that anything we create is art. However, Art Adjian disagrees, bringing up how instructional manuals have representations but not typically artworks. This raises a good point. A definition needs to be broad, but not broad enough to accidentally class everything as art, right? Also brought up by Art Adjian is the skepticism of art can or should be defined in the first place. I mean, after all, why do we need to define art anyway? Art Adjian also brings up many other definitions throughout history, each having its own differences and explanations. There's too many to list here, but if we can take only one thing from Art Adjian's entry, it's that art is difficult to explain and define. Issue 108 of Philosophy Now features an article that contains answers to the questions of what is art and or what is beauty, each answer of which was sent in by people who sent in their own answers and ended up winning a free book because of it. This is an interesting place to find a handful of relatively short answers to get from different people, and interestingly enough, each answer is pretty different. There are some common aspects, several of the entries talk about feelings, emotions, and expression, and there are of course references to aesthetics. But interestingly enough, there is also mention that art is not just a visual thing. Neil Hallinan refers to Marshall Dutram's 1917 piece, Fountain, a piece of art that is quite literally just a urinal with mutt written on it. By this point, you might see a pattern emerging, that art is hard to define. I could keep going, like bringing up how John Hospers once referred to art as bringing out a new combination of elements in the medium and elaborate further on that, but I think my point has gotten across. So what's our working definition moving forward? There is no real way to define art. Whatever you think art is, that's what it is to you. You can have your opinion changed, of course, but at the end of the day, it'll still just be an opinion. By considering something to be art, you've made it art to you. However, we need to be on the same page. We can't move forward without a consistent working definition of art that we can both understand. So let's just roll with my opinion on the topic, which is hopefully agreeable enough to the point where you can at the very least understand where I'm coming from based off of what I've just said, regardless of your own opinion. I believe anything made with human creative intent to create some form of experience, feeling, or emotion, and so on, can be classed as art in some form. Context matters of course, but I think if some level of creative intent was there, then it's art. I know this conclusion to the topic of what is may feel a little bit disappointing and may feel a bit like a cop-out, where instead of answering a difficult question I've essentially just said, it's up to you. But I feel as though it would be a little irresponsible to not make it clear how up in the air the definition is. And on a more philosophical level, I do believe that it's somewhat impossible to give an all-round definition of art that won't need to be updated in the future. Maybe one day that definition will or can exist, but for now, it's out of scope of this research. So with our working definition, let's move forward. Okay, so we've just defined art to the best of our abilities, but there's still an unanswered question. Are games art? And if they are, how? Going off of our working definition, yes. However, of course, the answer is up to you and how you perceive art. I do deem games as art, but of course, this is just my opinion. Again, I'm not going to try and tell you how to think, but I am going to present my viewpoint and explain why I feel that way. I should note as well that when I'm talking about games as art, I'm not just referring to literal art in games, meaning the visual presentation. I mean games as a whole, in the same way that a film as art doesn't just mean the visuals, but also the storytelling, acting, sound design, and so on. I am not at all the first person to talk about this. Discussion of games as art goes back to at least 2006, as seen in a blog post by Henry Jenkins, and while I have no actual proof to back this up, I've got a feeling that the discussion goes even earlier than that. When video games were new, they were highly gameplay focused. Pong is essentially just minimalist tennis, that's more or less all there is to it on a base level. However, as they began to evolve, stories started to get involved, even if only simplistic and only to come up with a reason for the stuff in gameplay to be happening. The story started to become a motivator in gameplay. You don't just want to keep going because it's fun, but also because Mario needs to save the princess. So now that there's a story motivator when thinking about games as art, does that put games as art in a similar field to film? Nathan Deardorff's 2015 article brings up a quote from famous film critic Roger Ebert, in which he mentions how things that would make games art often lean more towards being more of a representation of other mediums, like stories, novels, plays, dances, and films. Those are things you cannot win, you can only experience them. Deardorff counters this by asking the question, what is art if not experiencing a representation? Which I do have to agree with. Even the most surrealistic art pieces tend to be representational to some degree. One of the most classic, and also one of the bluntest examples, is René Magritte's 1929 piece, La Trahison des Images, or The Treachery of Images, which portrays a pipe, yet the writing beneath it claims it's not a pipe. Commenting on the piece, Magritte would at one point say, "The famous pipe. How people have reproached me for it. And yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I'd written on my picture, this is a pipe, I'd have been lying." To bring a video game equivalent, the pixels that together make up Mario aren't actually a person, they're just a way of representing a person. In his article, Deardorff also makes a good point about how games are one of, if not the only medium in which those who experience them will use personal pronouns to explain their experience, such as, "I unlocked the chest and found the treasure," or "I beat the boss, but the princess was in another castle, so I had to keep going." Something I'd like to add to this that isn't mentioned in the article is that in multiplayer situations, players will use other personal pronouns like we took down the wave of zombies, or we built a house. Though Deardorff's article makes some good points that I agree with, there's also some stuff I don't entirely agree with. When talking about Roger Ebert's stance on games as art, the article comes off as being slightly aggressive in its disagreement and gets dangerously close to ad hominem attack territory. At one point, Deardorff also comments on how being immersed in a nice looking digital field of virtual flowers or getting a rush from exchanging gunfire between online players does not in itself qualify a game as art, and I don't know, I actually think that rush and immersion is a part of games being art. It's something that's hard to replicate specifically in other mediums. Not that you can't get a similar rush from, say, a film, but I'd argue that being actively engaged in a game creates a very unique experience in a way that if you screw up, that could be bad for you in a way that's uniquely your fault. Deardorff also mentions how many games are made with the sole purpose of creating income, saying it's not that making money conflicts with art, but if the basic purpose in creation is financial, it is a widget for your bottom line, not a work of art. Comparing it to how dinnerware in Walmart is not artistic pottery, but a piece crafted to be sold. Now, I can understand on a base level what Deardorff is trying to say here, and I think it's an interesting point, though I don't entirely agree, at least not in the context of games. The point about mass-produced dinnerware is good and understandable, but I think it's important to remember that games are, by default, a very different process than physical consumer products. Game takes creative effort to some degree no matter what, whether that be a designer figuring out new mechanics, artists coming up with unique character designs, programmers finding ways to optimize their code, and so on. That all requires some level of creativity, doesn't it? Okay, so going back to the argument about mass-produced dinnerware, couldn't that also be considered art due to the background of said mass production? Somebody still had to design it in an optimal and cost-efficient way. Somebody had to put it into efficient production, and someone had to put the actual dinner in question together to actually create the products that you can hold in your hand. But notice a common word there. Efficient. I think this is where a line can be more easily drawn between art and product. I still believe that there may be an argument to be made about efficiently mass-produced products being art somewhere, as it's something I myself am not too sure about. However, I won't be going much deeper into that because that's kind of its own question which is out of the scope of this research. What I'm getting at is I think it boils down to the intention of the entire team. Maybe a game is made for a company to sell, but that doesn't inherently mean that the creatives behind it didn't make art. Earlier on, I mentioned a blog post by Henry Jenkins. This blog post was actually a follow-up to a piece he wrote about games as art. I mentioned that the blog post in question is from 2006, and while I have not been able to find when the original piece was written, there is mention of the PlayStation 2, original Xbox, and Nintendo GameCube, referenced as if they're the latest console releases, which puts this piece sometime around 2001 to 2006, which is basically 20 years ago now. So this discussion is well and truly far from new. A little earlier, I mentioned that Nathan Deardorff made an interesting point in his article about players using personal pronouns to describe their activity in games. In a similar vein, Jenkins' article notes the interesting concept of memorable moments, which ties into the personal pronouns point by effectively noting that there's something special about when it convinces you that you are really in charge of what's happening in the game. when the computer seems to be totally responsive, and when the computer does something that follows logically from your actions, yet doesn't feel like it was pre-scripted or pre-programmed. Games like Minecraft are in large part about the concept of emergent narrative, which is, to quote Eric Mernon, a phenomenon of unexpected contextual stories arising through play. In a game like Minecraft, no two playthroughs will be the same. The player will always naturally create their own narrative, which will have its own moments, and quite possibly even story arcs and story beats, even if the player isn't doing it deliberately or doesn't realize it. However, this concept of emergent narratives is present even in linear games. For instance, although Portal is a nearly completely linear puzzle game, every player will have a slightly different experience. Some players will solve puzzles more quickly than others, and those same players may struggle with puzzles that some others found easy. In that sense, a truly linear game is basically just a movie. And going back to Jenkins' piece, quoting Eric Zimmerman, games are more than simply mutant cinema. So, given all that, I think it's pretty safe to call games art for the most part. They're a new and growing art form, but they are art nonetheless, and they can provide their players with experiences quite literally impossible to get elsewhere. Films took time to grow and become more sophisticated in a way that I believe games will, and already are starting to be. In fact, they've been getting more and more sophisticated for a while now. A fair while, actually. And the rise of indie games over the past 15 years or so has only sped up this sophistication process.
This is the story of a man named Stanley.
The Stanley Parable is an interesting game. I know I already put a spoiler warning at the start of this video, but I'm going to give a specific spoiler warning for the Stanley Parable because it really is a game best experienced if you just play it. The less you know, the better. It's a game that's best experienced firsthand without any sort of knowledge of its content. So, given that, if you wish to experience it yourself, of which it's best to, this is your final warning before I get into proper spoiler talk. Are we clear? Alright, let's move on. The Stanley Parable is a game primarily made by Davey Redden and William Pugh. The game is about, funnily enough, a man named Stanley. Upon first hitting play on the main menu, the player was shown a cutscene featuring a narrator explaining that Stanley worked in a mundane office job in which he simply pressed buttons as instructed to, but one day found that those instructions stopped coming in, and so Stanley leaves his office and begins wandering the halls, which are now mysteriously empty. From here, gameplay begins. The narrator will guide Stanley throughout the office, effectively telling the player what to do.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
However, there are several points in which the player can disobey these directions and go in whichever direction they want. The narrator will comment on this if this happens.
This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
The game has several endings obtainable by going in certain directions. Each time the player gets an ending, the game will automatically restart them back at the beginning of the gameplay. In a large part, the game is really just walking around trying to find spots you haven't been to. There are occasional segments where the player is given more stuff to do other than just to walk, but it usually doesn't go much beyond just opening some doors or pressing some buttons. Going back to the point of the game's endings, I won't go through all of the endings as there are far too many to go over within the scope of this research, but what I will do is cover a few significant endings, as well as some of the exclusive content found within the Ultra Deluxe edition. To start, let's cover what has been dubbed the Freedom ending. To obtain this ending, the player must obey everything the narrator says, which, in the context of the game's story, ends up with Stanley finding a mind control facility underneath the office area and subsequently shutting it down, allowing him to escape and finally be free. This ending is interesting for several reasons. To start, it's one of the only endings in which the narrator sticks completely to the narration bit, because, well, he has no reason to get away from it. His directions are being followed one-to-one, and the story is going exactly according to the script. An interesting point about this ending, though, is that on paper, it's about Stanley breaking free of his mind control machine, and learning to be free for himself. But, as Leadhead puts it in her analysis...
Of course, the irony behind this is that we can only get the true ending by doing exactly what the narrator tells us. WASD, we're just supposed to push these buttons exactly as the narrator intended.
We effectively switch sides with Stanley. But okay, what happens if we don't follow the narrator's directions? Well, a possible ending in that case is the confusion ending. Depending on the way the player goes against the narrator's instructions, they'll find themselves in a strange area with the narrator commenting on this and accidentally sending the player to a part of the freedom ending before resetting the game himself. Things start getting strange, however, when the player finds themselves in unfamiliar areas in the following resets, with the narrator commenting on this.
Now this... well, I'll be honest, I don't recognize this place at all. Is this the story? I don't think so.
There are a couple more resets before the narrator introduces
The Stanley Parable Adventure Line.
and instructs the player to follow it to avoid getting lost again. However, the line eventually leads back to the room from before, and so in the next start, the narrator instructs the player to ignore the line and keep moving forward, which eventually leads the player to a room with a so-called confusion ending schedule, to which the narrator refuses to restart the game himself to break out of the set schedule. The game does restart on its own, but seemingly not due to the narrator. This is an interesting ending because it's a good example of something the Stanley Parable does a fair bit, personifying objects and turning them into characters. In this case, the adventure line is initially presented as just a visual line going across the floor, but as soon as it starts going off course, the narrator starts giving it character, acting as though the line leading the wrong way is a bit of simple mischief on the line's behalf, as if the line is a sentient thing that's deciding where it goes.
Oh no, not you again. Stanley, I'd also like to veto the line from having any role in our awesome new story. No lines or monitor rooms. Just don't acknowledge it, and we should be fine.
The line even gets its own theme song. Interestingly, in the subtitles, the line is always given a trademark symbol whenever it's referred to. Even when it's just being referred to by pronouns, there's a trademark symbol. If I had to guess, this may be somewhat of a gag around the overprotection of basic concepts that the copyright system tends to promote, but I don't exactly have anything to back that up, so it very well may just be a simple gag that doesn't have anything else to do with it. In an interview done by Mike Rose, David Redden notes that players love the form meaning out of the random events that occur in the game, even when there's absolutely no meaning to be found. The Stanley Parable is an interesting case of an artsy game where gameplay is used for the sake of not just player interaction, but for getting across something. In one ending, the narrator gets actively frustrated at the player for going off the set path.
What? Really? I was in the middle of something. Do you have zero consideration for others? Are you that convinced that I want something bad to happen to you?
But it does raise the question. As the narrator and supposed creator of this game, if you didn't want players to go that way, why would you let them? The narrator's frustration here, while humorous, isn't just a joke. It brings up questions about games as a whole. A common game design problem is figuring out how to avoid players going places you don't want them to. Tons of methods have been created over the years. Invisible walls, locked doors, impassable objects. Many open world games won't even really try to stop the player. They'll just let you keep going, sometimes discouraging doing so by preventing further progression if the player chooses to keep going. The Stanley Parable, in a lot of ways, is the ultimate answer to this problem. Or at the very least, it's in part a response to it. The whole game really does take this concept and just go, why stop the player at all when we can give them more content? Due to the nature of the game's environment, there's very little room for the player to go beyond the set path. There are a lot of doors around, but they are typically locked so the player can't get through. On top of that, the player can't jump. There's an achievement specifically called You Can't Jump, which you get if you press the spacebar to try and jump several times. Jumping is such a common movement in games, even when it's not always entirely necessary, that the lack of jumping in the Stanley Parable is noteworthy. It's another limitation on the player, another way of locking the player out of areas they aren't meant to go. This ties into what I was discussing earlier, the whole concept of what freedom actually is and isn't. The player is given so many options on directions to go, yet a lack of ways to go about doing it. There isn't even a sprint button. The player is constantly walking at the same pace. In that interview by Mike Rose, William Pugh says that, "We always intended for players to be able to play through the endings in any order they wanted, and for the game to feel like it worked. So we did our best to avoid pushing players to make particular choices. However, there were points where playtesters would not realise that they were being presented with a choice, and they'd miss out on something like the confusion ending or the red and blue doors, so we had to work to visually highlight these choices a bit more than others." This point is interesting as it shows the developers did have to nudge the player a bit. And if you look at some of the areas, you can kind of see where they've had to make it clear that you can go there. This is significant in this analysis because it implies that the developers very specifically want us, the players, to find these endings. They are not just meant to be secrets, they are deliberate parts of the game. In a weird way, there's a disconnect between the developers and the in-game narrator. And it's really up to the player to decide for themselves which path they'll take. Will they side with the narrator who wants a more or less linear story, or will they side with the game's developers who want them to go places they're being told not to go? In one of the endings, known as the quote, game's ending, the player goes off track so much that they end up in a room of developer textures, with the narrator saying that he hasn't finished making that part of the game yet. After a few sections in which the narrator attempts to fix the Stanley Parable, and a section in which he showcases another game that he says he's been working on, which consists of a 2-hour looping game in which all the player does is press a button to stop a baby from walking into a fire, the narrator ends up telling the player to just play someone else's game, and puts the player in a couple of different games, recreated in the same engine as the Stanley Parable. First up, the player is put into a Minecraft world, in which they watch the narrator build a dirt house and lead them down into a cave. However, after a certain point, the narrator stops the player and says that the game is far less linear than he was hoping for.
Oh, no. This is far more open-ended than I had in mind. I'm looking for something more narrow and linear.
After this, the player is put into the first level of Portal, a pretty significant contrast to the lush green open nature of the Minecraft world before it. This is just another example of the game's discussion about linearity. The narrator is put off somewhat by Minecraft's open nature, but then seemingly loses interest in Portal quickly due to Stanley's previous actions.
No, actually, you know what? I think that's plenty. I really don't care much to see you stumble through any more of these games, and I highly doubt you're any wiser for the experience.
So, what exactly does the narrator want? I won't go too much in depth with the Ultra Deluxe content, as that is a whole other can of worms that would send us down an extremely long rabbit hole, but there are a few points I'll mention about it and what they mean for the Stanley Parable as a whole. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a near one-to-one recreation of the original game in a different engine, with new content and some changes to old content. For instance, in the original game, the game's ending featured nods to Minecraft and Portal. The Deluxe Edition, however, instead features nods to Firewatch and Rocket League. Now, there's a chance that this change may have been somewhat of a licensing issue. For the original game, they had permission to use Minecraft and Portal from each of their respective license holders, and perhaps they couldn't get the licenses again. Or, if we look at it from another angle, maybe they just wanted to modernize it. See, a large part of the Stanley Parable, as a whole, is the meta aspect of it. There are the previously mentioned endings in which the narrator acknowledges the Stanley Parable as a game, and in Ultra Deluxe, it goes even further. In Ultra Deluxe, after playing a handful of endings, a door pops up in one of the hallways that just says new content. This piques the interest of the narrator, and if the player chooses to go through the door, they'll end up in an area showing the new content. The jump circle, a circle in which the player can jump. Oh yeah, and they have a limited number of jumps as well. There's no way to get your jumps back. Better make the best of it. Once the player has experienced the joys of the jump circle, they get taken to a room that thanks the player for enjoying the new content, which leaves the narrator extremely disappointed. From here on, the new content endings are a lot more structured, as in, they're kinda linear in the sense that you can only achieve one ending after completing the other. After the initial new content ending, there's the skip button ending, in which the narrator brings Stanley into an area called the Memory Zone, in which the narrator stores memories relating to the original version of the Stanley Parable. However, they eventually stumble upon negative reviews, which upsets the narrator and makes him create a room with a skip button in it that allows the player to skip the narrator's dialogue. Unfortunately for the narrator, the player ends up being stuck in the room, basically meaning that the only thing for the player to do is skip his dialogue constantly, to the point where the narrator's sanity declines before he eventually stops altogether. The game eventually resets on its own. This is significant. In a lot of ways, it seems to somewhat reflect the feelings of William Pugh, who, in an interview relating to Ultra Deluxe, had this to say about how the game has affected him. God, yes, the game has been delayed for 3 fucking years. Love everyone on the project, and it's so good, but there have been times where you look at it and think, this thing is torturing me. And by extension, torturing everyone who cares about me. Everyone in the company. We want it done, but because of expectations, it needs to be good. That's just stressful, pure, unadulterated chemical stress that trickles down to everyone around you, right? Then on top of that, COVID. I've not been home in coming up on 2.5 years. And then the process of the release is abstract and bizarre. You work on it for years and years. I've got nearly a decade of emotional investment in the Stanley Parable at this point. But it's going really well, Paul. And now we're all going on holiday. In another interview, this one by Heather Wall, Pugh would also say, I think everybody on the team has had different difficulties with the idea of taking this highly regarded and well-remembered game and bringing it back to life in 2022. The Crows team is incredibly talented, but everyone has had different challenges, recreating the feel of the Source engine in Unity, balancing the eerie liminal space feeling of Source engine games with advances in graphics and what players in the 2020s expect a modern game to look like. The Stanley Parable is a massively successful game, and for good reason. It takes the idea of freedom in video games and puts it into question. How much should freedom matter? Are players really free? Who's really the one with freedom here? The player or Stanley? But for a game with a massive legacy, how do you follow that up? What more do you add to the Stanley Parable? If it did so well, does it even need a remake with more content? What was wrong with the original?
And don't you get it, Stanley? The game was perfect. It didn't need anything else. It didn't need new content. It just needed to be left alone.
The Ultra Deluxe edition takes this and basically asks a question right back at us while also kind of giving us an answer. The answer is to, well, expand on what the original game was about. Go even more meta. I should note that I've only scratched the surface with the new content in Ultra Deluxe. There's tons more stuff to cover. I haven't even mentioned the bucket, which effectively doubles the number of endings in the game, and is another great example of how the game personifies inanimate objects and makes you genuinely care about them.
Stanley needed the bucket's warmth and comfort now more than ever.
But even with the new content in Ultra Deluxe, something interesting remains. There is no true ending to the Stanley Parable. You don't ever really win the game beyond seeing all the game's content and maybe waiting up to 10 years to get all the game's achievements. As William Hughes says, there is no perfect ending for me, but there might be one for you. Or, to put it otherwise, as the game's loading screen says,
The end is never the end, 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 is never the end.
There's no feeling more intense than starting over.
this is the first thing the developer of Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy says to the player after just starting. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is actually, I don't even really know what game genre it is. I guess it's a platformer? Either way, it's a game by Bennett Foddy, developer of titles such as QWOP and GURP. If you've played either of those games, you'll probably have an idea of what Getting Over It will be about. In the game, the player has the simple objective of climbing a mountain. The player plays as a man-in-a-pot whose only means of movement is by swinging around a large hammer. On paper, this is simple enough. On PC, you swing the hammer by moving your mouse, and that's really all there is to it. However, the controls are intuitively unintuitive. On paper it makes sense, but in practice it's pretty finicky and extremely easy to make mistakes with. The top of the hammer doesn't really stick to things, so it's entirely possible to have your hammer just slide off of stuff. And there are a lot of other subtleties and tricks to the movement that aren't immediately noticeable upon first starting. A major part of the game is the mountain you climb. It's designed in such a way that falling is extremely easy, and with the layout, there are some spots where you can fall down and lose hours of progress with a simple mistake, and in some spots you can even fall all the way back to the bottom. In most games, this wouldn't be too much of a problem due to save states, checkpoints, or some other kind of mechanic that easily lets you go back to where you were. But in Getting Over It, there's none of that. There is a save feature, but it doesn't let you get back to where you were if you fell. If you fall, you've fallen. There's no way to reload to a previous save. If you fall, close and reopen the game, you'll still be where you fell. On top of that, Bennett Foddy himself will narrate throughout gameplay, explaining how the game came to be, its inspirations, and its significance. In some situations though, his narration will directly comment on your gameplay, mostly when you fall, offering motivational quotes and music.
This thing that we call failure is not the falling down, but the staying down. Mary Pickford.
As you can imagine, this game creates some extreme reactions within people.
No! I'm done, I'm fucking done! Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you! No! Oh my god! Fuck, 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 fuck!
But I think this game is more than just a rage game. I'd say there's more to it than just a game aimed at frustrating the player. Because when I first played and I finally reached the end, something hit me. Finishing this game feels awesome in a way that I don't think many other games do, at least not traditional ones. In his narration, Bennett Foddy at one point says,
When games were new, they wanted a lot from you. Daunting you, taunting you, resetting and delaying you. Players played stoically. Now everyone's turned off by that. They want to burn through it quickly, a quick fix for the fickle, some tricks for the clicks of the feckless.
This is very likely in reference to how some older games were rough and pretty unforgiving. Foddy has spoken about it before. Born in Australia in 1978, at a younger age, Foddy never really got to play on more well-known gaming consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, due to trade and technical restrictions at the time, which led to Foddy mostly playing games that were rough and unpolished. In an interview with Alex Wiltshire on this topic, Foddy said they shared that with a disregard the fairness that comes from a culture of making games which, at the time, was very often teenagers in their bedrooms on contract to some publisher. That's almost invisible to you if you grew up playing arcade games because it was so ubiquitous, but it had a particular emotional flavour to it. You either get turned off by it when you're 5 years old, or you learn to enjoy that taste and persevere and come back and try again. This would later drive Foddy to create his infamously unforgiving and punishing games, allowing him to express this idea of difficulty in games that kinda got lost over time in favour of more forgiving games with fail-safes, to make sure you can easily pick yourself back up. Foddy at one point even made a public blog post about his favourite types of frustration in games, of which Getting Over It uses several. In another part of the game's narration, Foddy discusses the inspiration from another game, Sexy Hiking, a game by someone only known as Jazzuo. Sexy Hiking has more or less the same concept as Getting Over It, but it's a lot more rough. In the words of Foddy himself in his narration,
The obstacles in Sexy Hiking are unyielding, and that makes the game uniquely frustrating.
in his narration, Foddy also talks about the reality of the obstacles in Sexy Hiking.
And there's a sense of truth in that lack of compromise. Most obstacles in video game worlds are fake. You can be completely confident in your ability to get through them once you have the correct method or the correct equipment or just by spending enough time. In that sense, every pixelated obstacle in Sexy Hiking is real.
Here, Foddy is effectively expressing that a lot of what we call obstacles in video games aren't really obstacles, but are rather elements made to feel like obstacles. Once you've learned how to jump across a gap in Super Mario Bros., is that gap really an obstacle anymore? In Getting Over It, doing something once doesn't necessarily guarantee being able to do it a second time. In fact, the game doesn't guarantee you can do it at all. As evidenced by the Steam achievement that you can receive for beating the game, only about 8.4% of players have actually beaten the game, and who knows how far the other 91.6% got before just giving up. In an interview, Foddy at one point brought up the
flat goodness of video games.
And how, over time, he found himself getting bored with that. Games will always try and be steady with the design, making sure the player isn't too stressed or overwhelmed, while also making sure the player isn't bored due to not getting challenged enough. In a lot of ways, Getting Over It really doesn't care about that too much. The part of the game that's arguably the hardest, known as Orange Hell, is put more or less in the middle of the game. What ends up happening because of this is that players end up spending hours not just trying to get past this point, but just getting back. The fall at Orange Hell is pretty unforgiving for new players, and if the player is unlucky enough, they could even fall back to the beginning. When the player reaches Orange Hell, Foddy's narration says,
An orange is sweet, juicy fruit locked inside a bitter peel. That's not how I feel about a challenge. I only want the bitterness. It's coffee. It's grapefruit. It's licorice.
This is interesting because it more or less says that Foddy doesn't really want the victory of winning something, he just wants the experience of getting to the point of winning something. Or in other words, Foddy just wants the journey, not the destination. Later on in the game, Foddy says,
We have the same taste, you and I. It's not ambition, it's ambition's opposite. An obdurate mission to taste defeat. You'll feel bad if you win, so I put this snake in for you.
if the player decides to grab onto the snake, they'll be sent right back to the beginning. For reference, the section that has the snake is basically the last part of the game. If you've gotten to the snake, you have what it takes to get to the top. On a first time playthrough though, riding down the snake is more often than not devastating. In a video that Foddy did with Kotaku in which he plays Getting Over It, he made an interesting point about the snake.
I want to say this is a reference to one of my favorite games,
Which game?
Snakes and Ladders.
Whether or not Snakes and Ladders is actually a game or not, I'm not here to discuss. However, I do think there's an interesting point about it as a game, knowing that it is directly referenced in Getting Over It. Snakes and Ladders is an extremely simple game. The players roll a die to move their player across a board with the goal of reaching the end. If the player lands on the bottom of a ladder, they get to effectively skip part of the board, giving them a large advantage. However, if they land at the top of a snake, they have to go back to a lower space on the board. The thing is though, the players don't actually have a say on anything, really. They basically just roll their die and see what result they got. If you think about it, the dice used to play Snakes and Ladders are the real players, not the people who roll said dice. Sometimes those dice make good decisions, and sometimes they make great ones. As a human player, you can't really be good at Snakes and Ladders. I mean, I guess maybe you could learn the skill of how to get dice rolls to go more in your favor, but in the way that something like Noughts and Crosses / Tic-Tac-Toe has players at the very least strategizing, Snakes and Ladders doesn't really have that. It is quite literally a dice roll. Okay, but what has this got to do with Getting Over It? Well, the snake itself is a reference obviously, but on a more global level, I think the snake is a bit more than just a nod to Snakes and Ladders. I think it's also a reminder of something. the player really is in control here. There are little to no points in getting over it in which the player has no control. For the most part, the player is in control throughout the whole game. Every bit of progress is an achievement of the player, and every mistake is the fault of the player. If you watch people playing Getting Over It, you can often see ways they could have saved themselves from falling. The power of hindsight is really a great skill for this game. Okay, so Foddy's narration happens throughout the whole game more or less. As the player progresses, so will the narration, so certain points must be reached before Foddy continues talking. Earlier on, I mentioned a part of the game nicknamed Orange Hell. Once the player gets past this point, something interesting happens to Foddy's narration. He suddenly starts to sound a bit more personal, he addresses the player more frequently, and he starts talking a bit softer and closer to the microphone. This intensifies more as the player keeps going. By the time the player has reached the last point of the game, Foddy is basically talking with his mouth directly in front of the microphone.
Now, you've conquered the ice cliff, the platforms, the church, and the rectory.
Which is a stark contrast to the bold, almost presentation-esque voice he has at the beginning of the game.
They're built more for the joy of building them than as polished products.
And it's not just the way his narration is presented, it's what the narration is about too. Before I mentioned that he starts talking directly to the player a bit more, and in fact, almost everything he says relates to the player in some way. While earlier on he was talking more about the concepts that inspired the game, from the end of Orange Hell onwards, he starts talking about the player. At the very final section of the game, Foddy says,
I dedicate this game to you, the one who came this far. I give it to you with all my love.
After the player goes up further, the credits roll, while a spacey cover of Going Down the Road Feeling Bad plays, being sung seemingly by Foddy himself, and with alternate lyrics in place to reference the player's character.
I'm going where the climate suits my cauldron. I'm going where my cauldron's never cold.
This ending is very significant, I feel, because it reflects part of how the player feels upon beating the game. To add some context, Going Down the Road Feeling Bad is one of the songs that will sometimes play throughout gameplay if the player has a significant fall.
Going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down the road feeling bad.
Every rendition of the song used in the game is some kind of vintage recording. In contrast, Foddy's rendition at the end is a much more modern sounding cover using some sort of synth, I think. The main point is that it's a more modern sounding rendition. I think this is meant to reflect the player's new perspective of the game here. The satisfaction in seeing the stars light up around them as they ascend, realizing that it's over. They have finally reached the top. The sheer euphoria of realizing that all the work and pain is concluded. What's happening now is a celebration, the culmination of hours of work. It's all led to this. It's meant to drive home the idea that yes, it was worth it. The game isn't about getting to the top. It's the experience about getting to the top. It's the experience of getting over it with Bennett Foddy.
I'm going down the road feeling bad. Lord, I'm going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down this road feeling bad. And I ain't gonna be treated this away.
After the credits, which are handwritten and signed by Bennett Foddy himself, a screen pops up with text that reads, "Welcome to the top of the mountain. If you're alone, you can come inside and say hello." Underneath is a checkbox that confirms whether or not the player is recording or streaming the game. If you check it, you can click yes to proceed to what's up the top of the mountain. Now, I've done a fair bit of thinking about whether or not I should say what's up the top of the mountain or not. Initially, I was going to say that you need to play it yourself to see what's up the top, but there's a point I'd like to make about what it is. I'm not going to be showing any footage or screen caps of what it is. If you want to see it, you'll have to beat the game yourself, but I will describe it in basic detail, enough to make my point. Bennett Foddy himself has stated that,
Well, I mean, in retrospect, I just wouldn't put people in that situation.
referring to the end of the game. So I do feel a bit more comfortable in talking about it, knowing that Foddy himself doesn't seem to mind too much. I am once again going to add a quick spoiler note here. If you wish to see what's up the top of the mountain firsthand without any prior knowledge, now's your chance to bail at this point. Okay, we clear? Okay. Once the player hits yes, they're brought into a chat room where they can chat with others who have beaten the game. Once the player leaves the chat room, the only way to get back in is to beat the game again. The point I want to make about it is pretty simple. It's human. I think this is technically the most human way to wrap the game up, to talk to other humans. The whole game is a very personal human experience. In a lot of ways, you're fighting yourself to push forward. At one point, Foddy's narration says,
Have you thought about who you are in this? Are you the man in the pot, Diogenes? Are you his hand? Are you the top of his hammer? I think not. Where your hand moves, the hammer may not follow, nor the man, nor the man's hand. In this you're his will, his intent, the embodied resolve in his uphill ascent.
And I think this to some degree also extends to the player. The player is in a lot of ways playing as their own will, pushing forward despite the setbacks. I mentioned before that the credits feel a bit like a celebration, and if the credits are a celebration for beating the game, then the chat room is the after party, a spot to finally rest after some hard work, and you've earned this rest. So, okay, we've covered a lot here, and I think it is worth noting that each of these individual topics could have easily been their own presentation in their own right. I could have easily gone on more for all of them. But we went into this with a question that in some ways may seem like it hasn't actually been answered. How have indie titles such as Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy and The Stanley Parable utilised the medium of video games for artistic expression? Well, I'm going to try and summarise everything I've just said over this whole presentation into a single word. Gameplay. The Stanley Parable uses the gameplay aspect of player choice to discuss the very ideas of video games as a whole, and our freedom both inside the game and outside of them. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy uses gameplay to express hardships via its unforgiving gameplay, but also uses this challenge as a way to make completing it feel gratifying, and to create the sense that going through it is all worth it. Getting back to games as art. I hope my analysis of these games can help you see games as art a bit more. I believe that the medium of games allows for a lot to be done. The unlimited nature of game worlds combined with the ability to interact with them has tons of possibilities, and I have no doubt that in future as the medium grows further, we'll start to see more and more great artsy games come out. I personally am extremely curious to see what VR could bring for games like these, as it's already been used for some cool and expressive art pieces. If you still have doubts about games as art, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, because your opinion is valid. At the end of the day, I do believe that games are art, but again, that's just my opinion. But if you don't agree with that opinion, I do have something for you to ponder leaving this video. What if a game developer says their game is art?
And I think gradually my sort of philosophical upbringing has kind of bled into my game design work, but I don't think that stops it from being a creative art.
For me, it's a compact little self-contained art piece.
And also, possibly more importantly, what does art mean to you?
This is it, Stanley. Art. I did it. Video games are art. But you have a good 2 hours or so to go, so I'll just let you get to that. No time to waste when there is such a meaningful game to be played. Bonne chance, mon ami.
There's another good example that I think we see a lot of in video games now, where there's like a menu that allows you to choose a different color scheme. It's like they've put together 16 different but tasteful color schemes, and that to me is really strange, right? It would never be the case that you would walk into an art gallery and they'd be like, well, we've got all these different paintings. The artist did 10 variations for you. We want you to pick the one that you want to see.
Sure. Or like, I want to see Starry Night at dusk.
Right. Yeah, right. There's a kind of canonical fact about what Starry Night is, and that includes the materials it was made with, all the decisions that were made, the colors, the shapes. And we would never ask the art patron to decide any of those things, right? And yet, I go to these games which have like this menu, I now have to decide what color the game is. And immediately I think that changes my relationship to the game in a certain way.